how do we know we made a right decision if nothing went wrong?
5:50 a.m. Pack all necessary gear. Transceiver, probe, shovel, down jacket, first aid kit, skins. I always want to know the product I'm using works 100% of the time, because then I can rely on it for every day I spend in the backcountry. Being well trained in avalanche rescue and knowing that I use the best avalanche safety equipment on the market adds extra security to my day. I want to learn how to play safe and ski another day.
Our next presenter this evening is NWAC's very own Deputy Director, Dallas Glass. Since 2013, Dallas has worked in a variety of roles with the Northwest Avalanche Center. Currently, he serves as the Deputy Director and Avalanche Forecast for Snoqualmie Pass and the West-South zones. His presentation this evening will take a look at snow observations, what they can tell us, and how we can make the most of the information we collect. I'm sure there's a handful of you in the audience tonight that have submitted observations to NWAC or to other avalanche centers. I think it's safe to say after Dallas's presentation, we all might feel a bit more equipped to make those observations and figure out what to do with the ones we see written by other people. So Dallas, I will pass it off to you. Yeah, we can see it.
Excellent, great. Wow, Sarah, thank you. That was a really engaging talk. And I think my brain is already spinning. Maybe even some places I would tweak what I'm about to currently say. But it's just great to be back at NSAW. I always look forward to this time of year, getting to talk about snow, listen to some amazing presentations, and get kind of excited about winter. So for those of you who know me, who have heard me speak before, or maybe seen me teach, you know that my brain tends to go to pretty simplistic ways to try to make sense of some of these complex topics and put them in a way that I can actually deal with them and kind of process them on my own. And so tonight's talk for me would probably not surprise many of you. We're going to look at observations, the who, what, when, where, and why, kind of simple questions.
Dallas?
Yes.
Sorry, just to jump in real fast. Your screen just unshared. I think you're going to need to reshare your other monitor.
I don't have another monitor, but that's all right. Is it sharing now, Charlotte?
It's just sharing. There you go.
Yeah, there we go.
Thanks, Dallas.
That'll work. That'll work. I can't see my presentation notes anymore, but that's not a big deal. So tonight we're going to be looking at observations. And why observations? Well, you know, it's kind of been a big passion of mine for a long time in avalanche education. And honestly, we have kind of a unique winter in front of us, and observations have an opportunity to really impact the avalanche forecast. And so we actually didn't plan this, but Molly just used my phrase, equipping the community there. And I was like, that's great. That's a good plant. So let's kind of look at why these things will matter this year. Observations always matter. They're always really important to us as backcountry travelers, but maybe this winter even more so because there's a lot of uncertainty, not just uncertainty in the snowpack, but honestly, uncertainty in our lives. And one of the tools that we frequently address uncertainty with is gathering more information. And so one of the things we're actually looking at is, hey, like we want more information because that can really impact our safety. We have a great long-range forecast here in the Northwest, and I would imagine that that's kind of creating a little bit of excitement for all of us as we go into the winter. But that's kind of being tempered with some question marks about increased use. It's no secret that trailheads and campgrounds have been packed all summer long, and people are wondering like, hey, is that going to carry over into the winter? And if it does, that means more people than ever will be in the backcountry, and more people than ever will be looking to Avalanche Forecast and Avalanche Forecast centers for information and guidance. If you were at NSAW last year, you may have seen Robin Pendry and myself talking about avalanche forecasting and the avalanche forecast cycle. We start each forecast cycle with kind of trying to understand what's on the ground, those current conditions that are out there right now. We add to that a weather forecast, and we begin to think like, hey, how is the snowpack going to change? Am I adding load? Am I warming it up? Am I causing changes deeper within the snowpack? And this might lead us to anticipate different avalanche problems and ultimately the avalanche hazard. And that avalanche problem and that avalanche danger, that's what you see in every evening's avalanche forecast. And if we were to stop it there, it wouldn't actually be a forecast cycle. It would just be a forecast line, and that would make it woefully incomplete. So we actually need observations to really complete this forecast cycle. That allows us to actually check the forecast, to validate it and figure out, hey, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? And more importantly, why? It also, those observations not just help us validate, they also help us calibrate our understanding of the current conditions going into the next forecasting cycle. And that's super important. Here at NWAC, that forecast cycle is playing out every single day, not just once, but for 10 different zones, for 10 unique forecasts. And therefore, we really need observations and information from each of those 10 areas to really be able to validate our previous forecast and calibrate our understanding of current conditions going forward. So I don't think I could overemphasize enough how important observations are into this overwhelming, overarching forecast cycle that we go through. And so we really want to equip you, the community, to make sure that you feel empowered to make observations and implement them into your day. And that's a lot of what Sarah was talking about, is like figuring out, hey, how do we intentionally bring this information that we find, and how do we use it in our decision-making process? And a few weeks ago, I was emailing with Ben Vanderboss, who spoke last Tuesday. Ben is one of the forecasters of the Fourteenth Avalanche Center. And one of the things Ben said in his email really resonated with me. Kind of to paraphrase him, Ben said, you know, avalanche science is an observational science. It's something that everyone can do if they're willing to put forth the time and effort. It's not black arts with avalanche forecasters as the gatekeepers. And I think that's really important. This is for everyone, whether you're a guide, a patroller, or you just finished your first avalanche class. There's ways that you can make really great observations by just simply keeping it simple and keeping it relevant. So we're going to do that tonight by focusing on 3 items. We're going to focus on identifying relevant observations, implementing those observations into our decision-making process, and using those observations to better help your community. So I entitled this talk, Who, What, When, Where, Why, and Other Simple Questions to Ask the Snowpack. That's my simple brain using middle school English questions to try to understand observations. I blame a lot of that on my Alabama education. You could maybe reframe some of these questions into a timeline. That timeline being plan, make, respond, and report. I plan observations, I make those observations, I respond to those observations, and at the end, I report those observations. So let's start with that planning phase. And I think the planning phase is one of the most important parts of my daily risk management process. And that planning phase oftentimes starts with who. Who am I dealing with in the mountains today? And in this particular case, the who that I'm referring to is the avalanche problems. Each of these avalanche problems has a unique character. They're a little different. They have their own nuances. And we wind up approaching each of these avalanche problems just a hair different. This might be like some of your acquaintances or friends that you see at a barbecue or a party. You're going to approach and you're going to talk to each of them just a hair differently. The conversation, the questions you're going to ask are going to be a little different with each person. Fortunately, oftentimes, the Avalanche Centers are giving you a starting point for, hey, who am I dealing with out there in the mountains today? What avalanche problems are we anticipating? In each avalanche forecast, we're listing the avalanche problems that we think are going to be most prevalent out in the mountains today. That doesn't mean we're listing all possible avalanche problems you can encounter, but the ones that we think are the most likely. And that doesn't, you may find if you read further deeper into the discussion that there are other problems that we're anticipating that may be similar to these, or maybe they're less prevalent. So we may not have listed them, but we thought them enough to mention them. On Tuesday night, some folks pointed out, they said, hey, we noticed that y'all are only forecasting storm swab or wind swab. We aren't seeing you doing both like you used to for a long time. And this is a great example of that. Oftentimes, storm swabs and wind swabs have similar distributions, and we can approach soft wind swabs very similarly to the way we approach soft storm swabs. If we see a change in the character, the wind swab gets stiffer, or the distribution, it becomes more localized. that's when you see us begin to pick those two apart and use wind swabs very specifically, or maybe forecast both of them simultaneously. So the avalanche forecast is a great place to start figuring out who's at the party, but you can also bring to this question weather forecast, your own experience, and what you know about the terrain. And you may know that you may see avalanche problems in this specific valley that may not be prevalent across these large zones that we're forecasting for. So the who is the starting point, and that kind of begins to figure out what line of questioning I want to go down and what kind of information am I going to be looking for in the snowpack. Then I want to know what am I going to ask? What observations am I going to make? Three things really come to mind here. Number one, simple. Why use something complex when simple will do? There's no reason for me to bring out some Kestrel wind instrument when I can look at the wind blowing through the trees, feel it on my face, and watch it blowing the snow. There's no reason to necessarily dig a snow pit when I can immediately see roller balls rolling down due to warming during the daytime. Keep these observations simple. Keep them relevant. Back to our barbecue or party analogy. The questions you ask the snowpack will change depending on the avalanche problem you're dealing with. Certain people, certain avalanche problems respond differently to different lines of questioning. If you were to come up to me and talk to me about the stock market, I'm probably not going to give you a lot of feedback. I don't know a lot about it, and I'm probably not going to respond a ton. If you make the mistake of asking me about snow, I'm probably going to talk your ear off, and you might need to be rescued from the party by your friends because I won't shut up. So keeping these questions that you're asking the snowpack relevant to who you're dealing with, to the avalanche problem, really helps focus them. Lastly, I really want to make sure we state, don't forget the obvious. When we see those obvious red flag observations, those kind of things, I think Sarah called them bullseye information. That's just incredibly important. That means you're dealing with unstable snow. Again, Ben Vanderboss the other night, I thought this came out great in his presentation. Somebody asked a really great question. They said, hey, Ben, during that avalanche cycle, did you dig any snow pits or perform any stability tests? And Ben said, no, I was seeing avalanches. That told me everything I needed to know about stability. He was looking at the simple, relevant, and obvious information that was right in front of him. So that sounds great, Dallas, but how do I figure out what these simple, relevant, and obvious observations are? Use tools. Your level 1 course provided you with some information that would allow you to figure out what questions do I ask by avalanche problem. The ARI Avalanche and Observations reference is one of those tools, but there's a lot of great ones out there. Also, within the text of the avalanche forecast, frequently we're pointing towards observations that we're looking for that day to identify and assess the current avalanche problem that we're expecting to see. So use those tools that are in front of you. You don't have to get too creative here. Figure out what the avalanche problem is and plan to make those observations. I want to note that I haven't even left the house yet, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of information I need, and I might not have even finished my morning cup of coffee. It's great to plan for this stuff, but you got to carry through on the plan a little bit. This is one of those places where carrying through on your plan is a good idea. You want to make observations while you're out there. And when I think of making observations in the field, I think of two pieces, when and where. Maybe it's a relic of avalanche courses, but sometimes I feel like people think they need to stop to make an observation, and that's not necessarily the case. Observations are oftentimes a continuing, ongoing stream of information coming in. What's the snow feel like underneath me? Is there any snow in the trees? What's the sky look like right now? If I'm focused on my ski tips, if I'm focused on my hands gripping the handlebars of the sled, I'm probably not doing a good job of making observations. I really want to keep my eyes up, my head out there, and my mind engaged with what's going on around me. We can also think of when in terms of timeframes. Here in the Pacific Northwest, our avalanche cycles and conditions move at lightning speed sometimes. And conditions that are observations that we made an hour ago may not be relevant anymore. It could have snowed 2 to 3 inches in that time frame. So really understanding those days where things are changing rapidly and allowing that to also adjust our line of question. So it's when and where. The phrase that gets thrown around all the time is representative slopes. And that seems simple enough, but I'll say one of my longtime mentors, somebody I really respect in the avalanche industry, she always says that she struggles with this concept of representative slopes. And I think I agree with her, because we see it played out over and over in terms of avalanche accidents. We want to consider where we're traveling, aspect, elevation, feature, exposure, and really, does it represent, or how does it relate to where I'm going? I can think of countless outings where I could travel for hours up southwest facing terrain before dropping into north and northeast facing bowls. Frequently, I'm left standing there on the ridgeline pondering, like, how much do I actually know about the snow below me? And the answer very well may be nothing. This photo is an example of that. If you were to travel up from the left on the east facing slopes, you would find a lot of stability, a lot of wind stripping, not a lot of loaded snow. That would be really not relevant to the slopes out to the right or to the west, where there's big wind swabs and big wind drifts that have been built. So we want to think about when and where our observations come from. But now we actually have to respond to that. And this is where Sarah's talk gets really intriguing to me, because we're trying to figure out, like, how does all this information fit in this greater context? And having that devil's advocate that she brought up, where she can say, like, they can say, hey, like, here's this piece of information that we think doesn't line up. We want to know, like, how does this fit within the problems we expected to see today? Are they actually present? Are they not present? Are they where we thought they would be? And are they reacting like we thought they would react? Yes or no? And this is where I think seeking out that information that's contrary to what we thought can be really, really important. Because when things line up, that fits within that greater context. And I think Sarah called it the confirmation bias. Please forgive me if I'm wrong there, Sarah, but it really helps us. Like, we see all this stuff and we want to plug it in and we want to make it fit. What we want to be looking for are some of those unexpected pieces, those things that want to make us stop and reevaluate. And when we do find unexpected results, when we see unanticipated observations, that means uncertainty is going up. And there's that common phrase I'm sure many of you have heard, but as uncertainty goes up, terrain goes down. Or in a different way to phrase it, when in doubt, dial it back. Seek out lower angle terrain. We make all these observations, but at the end of the day, we really are trying to figure out, hey, is what I'm doing safe or not safe? And one of the ways we can do that is by comparing it to our larger information set as a whole. Honestly, if I saw people out there all winter planning for observations, making observations, and responding to observations, I would be stoked. I'd be so excited. I think that would be great. But that's still not the entire forecast cycle. We're still missing that loop. There's that part where it's actually got to get back into the forecast. And so I really do want to encourage all of us to report those observations as well. So how can you make the most out of your observations? You can make the most out of them, and you can have the greatest impact on the entire backcountry community by submitting those observations to your Avalanche Forecast Center. Sarah mentioned the idea of debriefing at the end of the day. I think that's one of the biggest things. Debriefing and planning, to me, are the two pivotal points of my day. And part of that debrief is reviewing and summarizing what I actually saw in the mountains and how it impacted me. Reviewing those observations is going to make me much more efficient at, hey, what actually worked? What didn't work today? And it's going to allow me to develop proficiency in that observational science skill set that we're really trying to develop. So take a moment to review those observations and to summarize those observations. And then at the end of it, all you have to do is take a second to submit those observations. Back to that forecast cycle, those observations really help us as forecasters to validate what we put out there that day, figure out what we got right and what we got wrong. And even more importantly, it shapes going into tomorrow, where we're looking at going forward. Dennis mentioned the other night, we have a new website coming out this winter. That's pretty exciting. With that is a new observations platform. It's super easy to use. It's easy to upload media. It can kind of shrink and swell depending on how much information you want to put in. We're really stoked on this new platform, and we think y'all will be too. So that begs the question, well, what's a quality observation? Some 4 or 5 things kind of come to my mind. I think of simple, relevant, some terms we've heard before. I think of avalanches, and I think of photos, and then how these things pertain to the avalanche problem. All too frequently, when I ask folks about observations, they're like, oh, Dallas, I didn't dig a snow pit, or I only have taken a level 1. That's great. Honestly, me too. Most of the time I'm like, I didn't dig a snow pit today, or the observations I made probably weren't anything past a level 1 anyway. It doesn't matter if you're a guide or if you're right out of your level 1, we want those simple, relevant observations. Take a second and think about what you were looking for that day. That's the same information that we want to know as forecasters. One of those simple, relevant observations is avalanches. Avalanches are super easy to interpret information, and there's not a single piece of data that can be more impactful on our avalanche forecast than avalanche observations. There's nothing that trumps this piece of data. So letting us know when you see avalanches, and even more importantly, if you triggered avalanches, is super important to helping us round out what we're seeing. Take lots of photos. Photos speak 1,000 words, right? And a photo combined with a location can paint an image, can paint a picture for a forecaster that might not have gotten to go to the field that day or may not have seen what you saw in the mountains that day. This gives us an opportunity to be in each of the places where you are on that day. So photos can really go a long way for us. And if you want to kind of step it up a notch, you can tie these observations back into that who question. There's a new part of the Avalanche observation platform where you can actually tie your observation directly to the who or avalanche problem. You can see kind of some great utility in how this can help us organize information as backcountry users as we kind of review our day. It also can help us as forecasters to be able to organize this information as we look into going into the next forecast cycle. And I think it's really important to remember, and I don't think I can overstate this enough, that we've been talking for years about NWAC as your community avalanche center, but you are an integral part of our daily forecasting cycle. It's really easy to think, NWAC's out there, they're gonna see it. But we at NWAC and our professional partners, we're just a really small group in a really large set of mountains that is your backyard. So we only see a fraction of the terrain that you see on any given day. And when you submit those observations, you become part of this entire forecasting cycle. So what are we gonna do this winter? Well, number one, be intentional about making observations, commit to that. Plan for observations, make observations, respond to those observations, and report those observations. You can do that by keeping those observations simple and relevant. When you see avalanches, please, please, please let us know about them and take photos. I can't overemphasize that. Take photos, take photos, take photos. Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. We're all one big backcountry community. And we really want to hear from each and every one of you, whether you're a guide or a patroller or an educator or a snow machiner or a snowshoer or a climber or a skier or a boarder. We're all in this together, and your information can help all of us come home safely at the end of the day. So thanks for taking the time to listen. I hope I bump into you in the mountains this winter. And when I do, I'm gonna ask you, what did you see?
Thanks, Dallas. I actually remember submitting my first observation and I was like very certain that it would not be helpful. And then getting a response actually from one of the forecasters at the time being like, oh, we never get observations from this area. It's super helpful.
Absolutely.
So I felt really good about it.
It's always
so we only have time for.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just saying we only have time for a couple of questions, and we're getting some right now specifically around representative slopes. Heidi is wondering, when your approach is a totally different aspect as your line, can you elaborate on why might you make an effort to gain observations of the terrain you want to ski, i.e. before dropping in, might you take the time to venture in more safely, say down a ridge or something?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, Heidi. Yes, you're hitting right on it. If I don't have information about the slopes that I'm about to travel on, it's really hard to get caught in an avalanche if I'm not in avalanche terrain. So you're going to see me ease into that terrain by using lower angle slopes well away from other avalanche terrain. So I have a moment to gain information before I drop in to bigger and especially more committing terrain. I always want to gain more information, and that might be that I've gained it on subsequent days, or I might need to take time out of that day before dropping in, or I just need to come to grips with the fact that I'm rolling the dice on that one and acknowledge exactly what I'm doing, which is rolling the dice.
Great. What sort of education opportunities are available this year, especially for people who are brand new and never been in the backcountry?
Oh, great. That's a great question as well. I've been spending a lot of time with this entire staff that you see here in front of you, working on new educational opportunities. You're going to see a lot of stuff out there. But at NWAC, we're going to have some online education tutorials that you can engage with. We have our avalanche awareness programs that are a great way to kind of dip your foot in a little bit. Sign up for our Backcountry bulletin that Molly has been putting out each week. That's a collaborative effort, and there's an educational piece in each of those. And our Laying Tracks program, a monthly seminar for new backcountry users. And then at the end of it, we want you to continue with more formal education, avalanche rescue classes, level 1s, and maybe even level 2s for certain folks. There is no shortage, and there's great resources on our website right now under the education tab.
Awesome. I have 2 more questions for you. This one's from Daryl. At what age does an observation become irrelevant? And that's the age of the actual observation, like a week after, a few days after.
Totally. Great question, Daryl. That has a lot to do with the avalanche problem, honestly, and how fast they change. These avalanche problems, like I said, they have different characters. They express themselves a little differently. There's a lot of great literature out there about kind of their life cycle and how long they're around. Certain avalanche problems are changing so fast that really observations that may only be a few hours old might be pretty dated. But when we get into those problems that say persist, persistent swabs, deep persistent swabs, that's where information can linger for several days and be really, really relevant. So I would say all information that comes in is super useful. And so please don't think like, oh, I was out there today, so now that's dated. No, no, no. Remember, there's that validation piece of the process that we still need. And we can all begin to take that information and roll it forward in our brains into how it might be different 12 hours, 24 hours from now. So it depends on the avalanche problem, but just because it might be old doesn't mean it's irrelevant.
And can you speak to ways that you might be able to gather good information if you aren't skiing? Let's say if you're on a snowmobile or just getting out in a different way.
Absolutely. I want to be really clear. I tried really hard to not talk about skin tracks. All of this applies no matter what tool is underneath me. No matter what way I'm floating on the snow, however I'm traveling, all of this continues to matter. I was out last year with some guys sweating. And you know what, like I'm not a very good sweater. A lot of my attention is focused on my hands and not ditching the machine. But at the same time, that snow, I'm still getting a response from the machine and how it feels in the snow. And I can tell when I moved from powder to wind swab to something that's crusty. I can still see whether or not there's snow in the trees, and I can see whether or not the sky is clear or not. So it's a matter of becoming comfortable on your travel tool so that your attention is not being taken up by the tool at hand, but that your attention, that's a little second nature. And now I can keep my head up and my mind engaged with the environment that's around me.
Nice. And I'm going to end with this question. You say that you want observations with avalanches. What if you're caught and carried? Can you speak to feeling reluctant to sharing a mistake? Maybe like touch upon that idea of shame and shaming, as Sarah had mentioned earlier as well.
Absolutely. That is a really good question. What I can almost guarantee you is that if I was to turn on every single camera of this panel that you have in front of you and ask them if they had been surprised and caught in an avalanche, every last one of us would raise our hands. As snow professionals, all of us have been surprised at some point. And that's part of it. And what we want to do is turn those near misses, those surprises, into a way to learn. And the only way to really be ashamed of that information is to hold it and internalize it. Getting it out there to the community is an opportunity to share and make sure that other people don't fall into the same trap. A local guide, an avalanche legend, Larry Goldie, works up in the Methow. He likes to call those near misses free lessons. And I really appreciate that spin on near miss. Yeah, it can feel shameful, like, man, I really messed up. But the only way I really see it as a mess up is if we keep it to ourselves and don't spread it around to our friends to help prevent someone else from being caught in the same trap that we were just caught in. So share those free lessons with us. And believe me, I can give you a high five on that one because I definitely have been surprised by several avalanches in my career.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dallas. Don't forget to submit your observations this winter.
Thanks, Molly.